Throughout the 1800s, cotton production dominated the South. In fact, by 1850, the South produced approximately 68% of the world's cotton. However, this production wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the inventions of the Industrial Revolution. Out of all of these inventions, however, it was Eli Whitney's cotton gin that initiated the Cotton Kingdom. Before we discuss this particular invention, we must answer the following. What led to the creation of the cotton gin, and how did it work? Born on December 8, 1765 in Westborough, Massachusetts, Eli Whitney was an aspiring inventor. When he was young, Whitney frequently worked in his father's workshop. There, he would take things apart and would put them back together. At the age of 24, he enrolled into Yale College in order to become a lawyer. Despite excelling in his classes, he found himself into a state of debt. As a result, Whitney moved from Massachusetts to Georgia to work as a private tutor. During his time there, he discovered one astonishing thing. Southern planters struggled to remove the seeds from the short staple cotton. Throughout the 1700s, two types of cotton were marketed: long staple and short staple. The long staple cotton consisted of long fibers that could easily be removed. However, at the same time, it could only be grown on the coast. Meanwhile, inland cotton planters had to grow the other type, short staple. The short staple cotton was not as great as the long staple because it consists of short fibers and virtually irremovable seeds. However, that was about to change. Backed by his employer, Catherine Green, Eli Whitney invented the tool that would initiate the rise of the so-called Cotton Kingdom, the cotton gin. The cotton gin worked in three simple steps. First, the cotton bolls were placed into the top of the machine. Next, the handle of the machine was pulled so that the cotton travels through its wire teeth. The wire teeth would then remove all the seeds of the cotton. Finally, the seedless cotton was pulled out from the cotton gin. Since the short staple cotton consisted of seeds, the cotton gin had the potential to not only remove the seeds from the cotton, but to also transform cotton production into a profitable luxury. In order to make it so, Eli Whitney must market his invention. With his focus finally shifted from law to cotton, Whitney and his newfound partner, Phineas Miller, placed the gins across the South. However, at the same time, they placed a fee that was about 40% of the profits gained by cotton. Outraged by the hefty fee, Georgian farmers created their own version of the gin. Due to the unrest, Whitney and Miller would eventually license their gins at a reasonable price. As a result of the new cotton gin, cotton skyrocketed in sales. In fact, after 1800, the yield of raw cotton doubled every 10 years. Furthermore, the demand of cotton rose as a result of the rise of cotton marketing. In other words, cotton was sold in nearby internal towns. From those towns, it was usually carried through rivers, canals, and railroads. Finally, the production of cotton encouraged the creation of other products around the world. For example, the North bought southern cotton in order to create textile products. Afterwards, the North would sell its textile to England to initiate the creation of cloth-based clothing. Unfortunately, despite the apparent benefits, cotton produced from the gin became so profitable that more slaves worked in greater areas of land. In 1790, around the same time the gin was invented, there were 6 slave states. However, in 1860, right before the beginning of the Civil War, there were 15 slave states, 7 more in less than a century. Overall, by the beginning of the Civil War, 1 in about 3 Southerners were slaves. In context of the life in the late 1700s and early 1800s, what more can we gather from his invention? Well, first, the cotton gin was invented during the same time when the tobacco empire declined. Well, the reason for that decline was because too much tobacco was made in too little time. In other words, tobacco was created in surplus while the soil that grew the tobacco weakened. Therefore, creating a new tool for a whole new crop, which is cotton, was very risky. Like I said before, cotton did succeed throughout the 1800s. Second, the eventual success of the cotton by the gin mirrors the success of tobacco in both its international profit and its slave labor. Finally, since most of the cotton was produced in the South, slave masters, as well as Southern politicians, gained power from the use of the cotton gin. Despite this, when commercial relations between the North and the South broke in the Civil War, the masters and the politicians would eventually lose power from both their cotton profits and their slaves. Therefore, I believe that the cotton gin caused both the rise and the decline of the cotton kingdom at the same time.